Akbar, the Great Mughal, 1542 to 1605. In the month of November 1542, Humayun, son of Babur and successor to the power which that great soldier had built up in northern India, was a fugitive, hunted and harassed in the parched and arid desert of Sindh. Indolent and pleasure loving, he had lost in a few years all that his father had won. And Sher Shah, the Afghan, now ruled at Delhi, while Humayun depended precariously on the chance hospitality of various chiefs, upon whose mercy lay through himself. In that month, he was the guest of the friendly Raja of Umarkot. He lay in camp with a small body of horsemen, some distance from the little walled fortress, while within it his wife Hamida awaited her confinement. On a night of the full moon, she gave birth to a son, and the next morning, messengers reached Humayun's camp with the news. Normally, such a day would have been spent in celebrations and the giving of presents, but Humayun was penniless. Yet, some sort of pretense at ceremony there must be. So, he collected all the valuables that the camp possessed and solemnly presented them to their rightful owners. Then, seated in his tent, he broke a pot of musk over a plate and distributed the grains among his personal followers. This is all the present I can afford to make you on the birth of my son, whose fame will I trust one day be expanded over all the world. As the perfume of the musk now fills this tent, he named the child Akbar, which means great. The first years of Akbar's life afforded little hope that his father's wish would be fulfilled. Indeed, seldom can a child have been born into such a hazardous environment. Within a year, he had been separated from his parents, captured by his uncle Ankara, while Humayun fled westwards to Persia and taken to Kandahar, where his uncle ruled. Thence, he was moved to the court of his other uncle, Kamran, at Kabul. That neither uncle chose quietly to murder him for fear Lai might be a potential rival to their ambitious ambitions was a lucky exception to the general practice of those days. 2 years later, in 1545, Humayun, with Persian aid, defeated both his brothers and entered Kabul in triumph, where he ruled for the next 9 years. But his position was for long insecure, and he had to make frequent expeditions to quell revolts. During one of these, Kamran reoccupied Kabul, and it is told how, while Humayun was trying to retake the city, Akbar was held aloft on the ramparts as a target for his father's artillery. If the story is true, luck was with him, as it was to be so often, for he escaped unscathed. Humayun was a man of culture, a lover of art and learning, but for long it appeared as if his son would have none of these things. He was given tutors, but obstinately he refused to learn either to read or write. He seemed happy only when he was with animals. Over wild beasts he developed early, an extraordinary power, and there were few, however savage, that he could not tame to his will. The life that during these years in Afghanistan he chose whenever possible to lead was that of a tamer of beasts, rather than of the heir to empire. The building of Fatehpur Sikri in 1569, Akbar's son and heir Salim was born at Sikri. To commemorate the event, he started to build there his new and magnificent capital, Fatehpur Sikri. The age of 12, there were few signs of the embryo statesman, but perhaps those around him wondered what would happen if some day he chose to exert his abnormal willpower over men as well as over animals. For the moment, however, he was or seemed no more than a wild, untutored boy. Humayun had never given up hope of regaining his lost empire, and in 1554 he found his opportunity. The Afghans who ruled in his stead at Delhi were quarreling among themselves. Humayun, accompanied by Akbar, crossed the Indus in December, recovered the Punjab, and finally re entered Delhi, which he had left in flight 15 years earlier. He made Akbar governor of the Punjab under the tutelage of Bairam Khan, his ablest and most faithful supporter. Then suddenly, a year later, he died. So, at the age of 13, Akbar was proclaimed emperor. Emperor of what? It is the question that has faced every man who has aspired to make himself ruler in India, and which was to face Akbar, the greatest of them all. To the day of his death, the answer in January 1556 was of very little. Two armies still held the field in overwhelming superiority against the Mughals. And behind, in Afghanistan, was open insurrection. One defeat, and Akbar would become like his father before him, a hunted fugitive. Bairam Khan acted with great resolution and marched at once against the vast Hindu Afghan army under the command of the Hindu Hemo, which had occupied Agra and Delhi. The army, small but compact against vast but unwieldy, met on the historic field of Panipat, three times the scene of battles decisive in Indian history. Hemu's army was routed, and Hemu himself, blinded and unconscious, was dragged before the young emperor. What followed is uncertain. Akbar was bidden by Bahram Khan to strike off the head of his helpless enemy. But whether, as some say, he obeyed eagerly or whether he shrank in disgust from such a deed will never be known. Hemu, by whatever means, was killed, and with his defeat and death, resistance collapsed. Akbar was emperor, now in more than name. The Mughal power was foremost in northern India. For the next 4 years, Bahram Khan ruled the country, and Akbar's foster mother, Maham Anaga, ruled the palace. Akbar seemed content to remain in the background, a cipher emperor, but all the time he was developing and learning. To the day of his death, he remained illiterate. But now he was eager that people should read to him. Above all, his favorite works, those of the Sufic mystic poets. The choice was significant, showing the growth of a mind at once highly intelligent and at times despairing of the world as it was. It contrasted strangely with the wild, animal side of his nature, unsubjected as yet to any self restraint. An incident when he was 15 illustrates the contrast. Suddenly, violent and self willed, he demanded one day his favorite horse, vicious and high mettled, and galloped away alone and furiously into the empty plain that lies around Agra. As suddenly he dismounted, he fell into a trance, and in his own words, communed with Allah. Presently he awoke to normality, to find himself alone. His horse had galloped away. He waited, uncertain what to do. Then he saw in the distance his horse galloping across the plain to him. It was a sign that he must return to the world and find his life's work therein. The story is Akbar's. What is important is that he believed in it. He was learning about people too. Often, after night had fallen, he would slip out disguised from the palace to mingle with the crowds in the bazaar, watching their behavior, particularly the behavior of the Hindus. More than any other Mughal ruler, he came to realize the point of view of his Hindu subjects. And in the palace, he watched the intrigues, the plots, and counterplots of the courtiers who surrounded him, though he gave as yet no sign that he noticed them. Bairam Khan and Maham Anaga regarded him still as a boy. The court's main fear was lest his reckless bravery should lead to disaster. He would have two elephants goaded into savagery, then ride one against the other, so that it seemed he must be killed. But no beast was too violent and vicious for him to control. Such was Akbar in 1560. Court intrigues came to a head in that year. Maham Anaga had grown jealous of the power of Bairam Khan, wishing his place to be held by her own son Adam Khan. The young Akbar listened to her advice and moving for safety's sake to Agra, issued from there a command that Bilgram Khan should go on pilgrimage to Makkah. The message that he sent was curt and uncompromising. I have determined to take the reins of government in my own hands, and it is desirable that you should make the pilgrimage to Makkah, upon which you have been so long intent. Addressed to one who had served both Akbar and his father so long and on the whole so well. It might have been intended deliberately to provoke disobedience. Such was its effect. But Bairam Khan's rebellion was short lived. Akbar pardoned him on almost unheard of occurrence in those days. But on his way to Makkah, the old warrior was murdered. His son Abdul Rahim was brought to Akbar, protected by him, and became one of his most faithful supporters. Maham Anaga thought herself triumphant. Her son would now succeed to the position of first soldier in the land. Akbar seemed to acquiesce in this arrangement, and Adam Khan led an army to subdue the kingdom of Malwa. He succeeded in his task, but he failed to send to Akbar either the booty or the captured woman. For the first of many times, Akbar acted with unexpected, overwhelming swiftness. Before his foster brother knew that he had left Agra, he appeared in his camp. Taken unawares, Adam Khan begged forgiveness and on the treaties of Maham Anaga received it. But Akbar did not forgive him. Adam Khan hastened his own doom. His mother grew jealous of a new minister whom Akbar had appointed. Adam Khan stabbed him to death in the place at Agra. Roused at death of night from the harem where he was sleeping, Akbar confronted the murderer. Adam Khan raised his sword against him, whereupon Akbar struck him senseless with a single blow on the face. He commanded that he be thrown from the wall of the fort into the moat below. When the servants picked him up from the ground, he was not quite dead. Akbar ordered that he be thrown down again and watched while the man who had been his boyhood's constant companion was hurled again to his death. Maham Anaga, prostrated by grief, died 6 weeks later. Akbar had asserted himself. Those who had sought to dominate him had paid dearly for the attempt. At the age of 20, Emerging, emerging, in the words of Abul Fazl, his historian and devoted servant, from behind the veil, he assumed absolute control of his government, never to let it go. In the previous 2 years, he had displayed ingratitude and an almost barbarous cruelty, but he had also shown unsuspected powers of swift, decisive action, which had brought him to a position which, at the time of his father's death, had seemed quite beyond his grasp. To that power of swift action, allied to great physical strength and to bravery that in anyone else would have been wanton recklessness. He owed the unbroken series of military successes that marked his reign. He seemed always to think quicker, act quicker than his opponents. The semi independent states of central India, even Chittor, the proudest and most stubborn of them, all come under his effective control. And Gujarat, bringing an outlet to the sea. Bengal was his, and Gondwana and Orissa. He never knew defeat in battle, and only when in his last years, like his successors and as unwisely, he crossed the river Narmada to add the Deccan to his dominions, did he suffer any sort of check. Such achievement alone would have been sufficient to rank him with the great conquerors of India. But it is as great soldier, statesman, and religious inquirer combined that Akbar is unique in Indian history. And in the fact that he realized that India must be united by consent as well as by force if his empire was to survive him. The keystone of his statesmanship was his conciliation of his Hindu subjects. No previous Muslim conqueror had even thought of such a policy. Yet Akbar had already, in 1561, married a princess of Amber, a leading Rajput house. Rapidly, he pursued his policy. For many years, every Hindu had been forced to pay a pilgrim and a poll tax. Both these were now swept away. Hindu princes sat in places of honor at the court at Agra. Tansen, the great singer of Gwalior, became one of Akbar's intimates. Later, Todarmal was to reorganize the finances of the empire, and Man Singh was to become Akbar's most trusted general. Though he ruthlessly crushed those who opposed his desire to conquer, as when the gallant Rajputs of Chittor were massacred because they had resisted so long and so bravely. He nearly always conciliated after he had crushed. He caused statues to be erected in Delhi to Jaimal, Chittor's chief defender, and to Patta, the young prince who had perished in the siege. His most perilous and spectacular military exploit in these early years of his power was his famous march to Gujarat. Rebellion had flared up after that province's conquest in 1572. It was midsummer and the rebels had no thought that Akbar would attempt the 600 miles march from Agra to Ahmedabad through the stifling heat of Rajputana. Within 11 days, he was upon them. At once, though outnumbered, he attacked. In his impetuosity, he outdistanced his followers, found himself a river at his back, almost alone, and faced by a large force of rebels. Without hesitation, he charged, and astounded and terrified, his opponents fled. In a few hours, the city had capitulated. Henceforth, his enemies in battle were to regard him always as more than human. In the early years of his reign, Akbar made Agra his capital. There two sons were born to him and died in infancy. He grew to hate the place and to be fearful of having no heir. A Muslim holy man living in the barren neighborhood of Sikri prophesied for him three further sons. Shortly afterward, his Hindu wife became pregnant. Akbar sent her to Sikri, where his child and heir Salim was born in 1569. Akbar, who did nothing in half measures, began to build there at phenomenal cost the city which for 15 years was to be his capital. The scene of the richest life, the most splendid court, some of the finest architecture of the age. Even today, deserted for 350 years, Fatehpur Sikri, with its ruined red sandstone walls and palaces, remains one of the wonders of the East. In the royal stables of this city, bigger than the London of that century, were 5,000 elephants. At the court, painters richly rewarded evolved that exquisite style of painting, half Persian, half Hindu in origin, which we know as the Mughal school. Within the city walls, it is said that 5,000 women inhabited the zinnia, awaiting Akbar's pleasure, while young nobles played polo by night with specially illuminated balls. Fatehpur Sikri became the setting for a display of imperial splendor and at times excess that has seldom been rivaled. It was the scene also of Akbar's greatest experiment, the founding of a new religion. He had favored the Hindus. As the years advanced, he came to a hatred of the fanatically orthodox Muslims, who aspired to a monopoly of religion. His inquiring, semi mystic mind revolted against their absolute acceptance of the words of the Quran, and he saw them as the real obstacle in the way of the unification of his empire. Also, and less worthily, he wanted to be its religious as well as secular head. In 1575, he started religious discussions between the various Muslim sects, at which he was the audience. Each speaker drove him further from the religion of his fathers. He preferred what the Hindu thought. It approached nearer to his own secret mysticism. But for a while, he preferred to any other doctrine the exciting new creed of Christianity, brought to him by Portuguese missionaries from Goa. In 1577, the Jesuit father Pereira visited the Mughal court, and in 1580 there arrived the first formal mission led by Aquaviva and Monserrati. Meanwhile, Akbar had himself proclaimed Imam-e-Adil, spiritual head of the empire, and had passed laws forbidding the building of new mosques and the appointment of new Muslim judges. He thereby jeopardized the loyalty of strict Muslims. For a time, it seemed that he would make Christianity his religion. Christian worship was encouraged at Fatehpur Sikri. The Jesuit fathers were offered riches and honors, which they declined, and Murad, Akbar's second son, was given instruction in the Christian faith. The fathers themselves thought they were gaining a convert, but Christianity seemed to Akbar on closer acquaintance as intolerant of other faiths as Islam. It was dogmatic, and his mind revolted from dogma of every kind. Moreover, It demanded from him a spirit of humility and obedience, which he was not in the least prepared to give. The fathers insisted that he should give up the excesses of his daily life, and on occasion he was himself revolted by them. In the middle of an enormous hunt, when the beast had been driven in by beaters from a radius of 40 miles, he suddenly ordered the hunt to cease, letting all the animals grow free and unharmed. But he was not prepared to forego his pleasures at the command of others. Pleasures that were as much as part of him as his occasional mystical experiences. So he rejected Christianity, as he did every other established religion. Though he encouraged the Jesuits to remain, dissatisfied with them all, he invented a religion of his own, which he called the Deen Ilahi. Its principles, never very clear, seem to derive mainly from Hinduism. There was to be one impersonal God, the sun, stars, and fire being his manifestations. The objects of all men were to be the conquest of evil and the practice of virtue. In practice, it became almost at once a glorification, then a deification of Akbar himself. It survived until Akbar's death, but it survived only through the personality of its founder. Its active supporters numbered only a handful. Abul Fazl and his brother Faizi, Hindus close to the throne like Raja Birbal and Todar Mal, and unwillingly Abdur Rahim and Man Singh. Its opponents were many and bitter. It provoked serious rebellions in Bengal and Afghanistan, which it took all Akbar's military genius to quell. In opposition to it, rallied its opponents round Salim, the heir to the throne. It was in fact a failure, but it was a magnificent failure, the mistake of a great man who had overreached himself. Religion was not Akbar's sole preoccupation. During these brilliant middle years at Fatehpur Sikri, he did much to improve and stabilize the administration of his empire. Unafraid to surround himself with able men as his ministers, he went far towards abolishing the corrupt feudal Jagirdar system. Taxation was no longer farmed out. Communications became safer, and later, by giving full rein to the genius of Todar Mal, he allowed the evolution of a system of taxation that was copied centuries later by the British. Judged by the standards of the day, Akbar's administration was a marvel of enlightened government. There were hideous poverty and wretchedness, but there was a measure of justice and enlightenment, as in Akbar's ban on the burning of widows. The 15 years in the rose red city marked the zenith of Akbar's glory. He lives for us in numerous paintings by Mughal artists of his day and in the writings of his contemporaries, almost fair in complexion, burly, but not tall. He had small regular features, intensely mobile, a flashing eye, a head carried slightly on one side. The key note to his temperament was energy, that on occasions exploded into unbridled excess of violence. It has been said of him that in whatever semblance of man, he is recognizably the king. Whether giving audience, gorgeously arrayed to his nobles, or appearing as he did every day before the common people, his was an overmastering personality, incalculable but great. Incalculably, he deserted Fatehpur Sikri and made Agra once again his capital. There he was to retain his power and much of his prestige. But his glory was to be dimmed. Success, it is true, still attended him, and Sindh and Kashmir were added to his empire. But Muslim discontent grew steadily, as did the disloyalty of Salim. Akbar, like his descendants after him, suffered cruelly from the behavior of his sons. Murad died from delirium tremens. Daniel, for long the favorite, became a worthless degenerate. Salim, moody, uncouth, and bitterly jealous of his father, became an open rebel. By 1593, India, north of the river Narbada, was Akbar's. There remained only the Deccan to conquer. In that year, Akbar demanded from the ruler of Ahmednagar acknowledgement of his paramountcy, and on the latter's refusal, sent his army southwards to enforce his demands. It was 3 years before they achieved any success, and though Ahmednagar then ceded the province of Berar, no conclusive victory was achieved. In 1599, Murad, joint commander in the Deccan, died, and Akbar, who had hitherto remained at Agra, took command in person. As always, his presence brought victory. The great fort of Asirgarh was taken amid scenes of horrible cruelty, and Ahmednagar itself, gallantly defended by the Princess Chand Bibi, fell in 1600. But if his presence brought victory, his absence from Agra brought open rebellion by Salim, who proclaimed himself emperor at Allahabad. Akbar left Abul Fazl in command in the Deccan, and returning northwards, forestalled Salim's march on Agra. Then followed a stunning blow. Abu Fazl, returning north, was ambushed and murdered at Salim's instigation. and his head brought in triumph to Allahabad. In all Akbar's triumphs and schemes, Abu Fazl had been nearest to him of all, his most staunch and unwavering supporter, his dearest and constant friend. Akbar raged against Salim, but either he could not or he would not advance against him. There followed negotiations, at the end of which father and son were officially reconciled. But Salim still plotted, while a party at court was planning to supplant Salim by his son, Khusra. Finally, Akbar, hearing news of a new plot, commanded his son to come before him. Salim refused, and Akbar marched against him. In vain, his mother, the aged Hamida Begum, pleaded for her grandson, but less vainly while Akbar was marching did she die. Akbar turned back to mourn her according to Hindu fashion by shaving his head at Agra. There he heard also that his third son, Daniel, was dead. How could he march against his only surviving son? He relented, and Salim was persuaded to submit. But at their meeting, Akbar's pent up rage and resentment overcame him, and he struck him, cursing him across the face. Salim, cowed before him, was put under arrest. But in a few days, Akbar's rage turned to forgiveness. Salim was pardoned and went free, though not yet assured of the succession to the imperial throne. He had not, however, long to wait. Men who live violently, vividly, and emotionally often die suddenly. Akbar was taken ill with dysentery in 1605. The tragedies of the previous years may have hastened his end. In October, it became known that he was dying. Some of his last visitors were Jesuit fathers, still welcome at his court, but he was not to be converted. Finally, Salim was summoned. When he reached the sick bed, Akbar could no longer speak, but he made signs that Salim should clothe himself in the imperial turban and gird on the sword of Humayun. The succession was assured. Then, after a while, on October 27, he died. But his empire lived on after him, to be destroyed only by the mad bigotry of his great grandson, Aurangzeb. The wonder of his age, he does not diminish in stature with the passage of time. Part mystic, part man of action, gentle and cruel, tolerant and self willed, ascetic and voluptuary. He astonishes us today by the complexity, but still more by the intense force of his character. The hope expressed by his father that his fame would spread through all the world has been fulfilled. The child born in poverty and flight in the desert of Sindh became Akbar, the great Mughal, one of the great men of the world.